Most welcome, everyone, to this lecture with Professor Michael Lackner. This is the very first event of this spring semester at the Swedish Collegium for Advanced Study, and it is part of our program in Chinese Studies, which is named for the renowned Swedish scholar Bernard Carlgren. We are delighted that Professor Lackner is visiting us this term and that he is willing to kick off this term for us. Michael Lackner is currently professor of Chinese Studies at the Georg-August-Universität in Erlangen-Nürnberg. He is also director of the Internationales Kolleg für Geisteswissenschaftliche Forschung, or in English, the International Consortium for Research in the Humanities, and this is also at the University of Erlangen-Nürnberg. This colleg, or consortium, is constructed so that all the scholars in residence are concerned with one important and very broadly encompassing theme, and that is faith, freedom, and prognostication. Am I right? Yes. I'm saying it only in English. Faith, freedom, and prognostication. Strategies for coping with the future in East Asia and Europe. How do we compare and link up different views on fate and destiny? This is a fantastic theme. Michael Lackner is a member of a number of review panels at the Institute for Advanced Study at Princeton, for example. He is also a member of the advisory board of the German Ministry of Education and Research, and he is a member of the National Academy of Sciences, Leopoldina. And his work in Chinese studies, you just have to look over the titles. His work in Chinese studies is very broad and ranges from classical study to the history of political thought in China, and not least to the history of Chinese Western cross-cultural encounters and transfers. And that list is long, but I'm sure some of you are familiar, much better familiar with the titles than I am, but it is really enticing. It whets your appetite to read them. Polyphony embodied, freedom and faith in Gao Jingjian's writings, for example, or new terms for new ideas, Western knowledge and lexical change in late imperial China, or mapping meanings, the field of new learning in late Qing China. Professor Lackner, we're delighted that you're here. Looking forward to your lecture. Please.
Thank you very much for this kind introduction. I mean, I first, of course, have to express my gratitude to the entire Scas staff. Here it was a perfect environment, made me achieve in 3 weeks, in fact, more than in 3 months at my place. So, and of course, there was a sub-host, Professor Christoph Harpsmeyer, who has been helpful not only for our project on the first Chinese translation of Thomas Aquinas' Summa Theologica into Chinese, but also for parts of this talk while Scas fed me at lunch, Christoph fed me during the evenings, and both with his specialties and with his broad knowledge. Now, let me come to my point here. This is an experiment, first of all. The talk was sort of designed for this place, so that made me work. And it is, of course, as has been mentioned, related to a project, studies of, or investigations, you could say, into traditional methods of forecasting Chinese and European and their assessments. The question of theorizing them, that was, is something that is still intriguing me. Now, you don't have to take the topic very serious, because I will just try to get very fast through these narratives. So the title is perhaps somewhat misleading, because my aim is to confront these two Western master narratives, or grand narratives, according to Lyotard, with a voice from late imperial China and provide some evidence for the fact that perhaps both are grossly overstated, but that serves as sort of demonstrating my own hypothesis on Chinese approaches, on a certain Chinese approach to strange phenomena. Now, there are numerous Western narratives, as you all know. We could call them smallest common denominators. That is, so to speak, a totalizing a global cultural narrative schema for China. But two of them have been of enormous importance. The first one celebrates China as the embodiment of rationality. That is something you will find here, even in the title of this talk. And the other one that claims exactly the opposite and makes an extensive use of the term superstition. So the first starts, I apologize for the bad quality, it will become better when we move on. Starts with the Jesuit missionaries in China, with their translation of 3 parts of the Confucian canon. They declared Confucius a philosopher, Confucius Sinarum Philosophus in 1687, or here you can see the frontispiece, and even earlier, a couple of La Science des Chinois, which had the subtitle Scientia Politico-Moralis. Also, we all know the consequences of this image of China for the history of enlightenment. The apogee with Christian Wolff's on the practical philosophy of the Chinese, the Oratio de Sinarum Philosophia Practica of 1721, but long before the Jesuit superior Alessandro Valignano in 1583, that was the date of the entry of Matteo Ricci on Chinese soil, so to speak, made what I would call a first cross-cultural comparison between India, China, and Japan. And of course, China wins the award because it is solely guided by reason. And of course, we shouldn't forget Leibniz, who called the Chinese emperor a magnificent prince, guided solely by reason, once again, you see. So, of course, this famous statement by Voltaire, how much more preferable is a man like Confucius, the chief among mortals. He relies solely upon reason and not upon lying or the sword. So here you have this climax, but I suppose this is all very familiar to you. Now, this favorable image begins to be modified during the second half of the 18th century through merchants' travelogues, less idealistic, of course, these merchants than the missionaries, more realistic perhaps. Then you have debates in British Parliament around 1750, where that starts. We have to mention Montesquieu with his not very favorable image of China. Romantic criticism of reason enhances criticism of China with the philosopher Herder, who speaks of a slave nation, slave's nature, unfortunate and deplorable subtlety in trifles and things like that. So the image has changed, but it's still the same sort of the same substance that is in the European heads. Now, now let us turn to one of the most important representatives of the idea that China is not the land of reason, but the land of superstition. Now, Jan Jacob Maria de Groot, a Dutch sinologist, was essentially a historian of religion. He thought that one spiritual essence could be detected beneath a great variety of religious, philosophical, and even political expressions in China. And his life work was sort of the discovery of an exposition of that essence, a master narrative once again. He had spent 9 years in East and Southeast Asia, and now he was sort of searching. First of all, he made observations. as a visitor, so to speak, a participating observer, as we could call him. And then he's tried to broaden that, or to sort of corroborate this kind of knowledge by looking into the most important scriptures, or things he considered to be the most important scriptures of China. And just to show you something, I mean, this is just one formula that embraces this spirit, this belief in spirits and ghosts, which you find more or less, you know, in a nutshell here. They haunt every frequented and lonely spot, and that no place exists where man is safe from them, that is to say, the ghosts. And that is, now he published 6 volumes on the religious system of China, and the one you just saw, the Universalism of the Religion of China, a key to the study of Confucianism and Taoism. Now, just let us have a look at some of these, more the sources than the text, which would be difficult to study in view of some mistakes he even committed during translation. But here you have the classic on ritual. You have here, very interesting, the Da-Qing-Hui-Dian, which is the last and the largest of the statutory encyclopedias of an imperial dynasty, and that we have 4 editions of that. The last one was compiled by 1901, and it's always up to date, so to speak. And the interesting thing is, I mean, what I want to emphasize here with de Groot, that it was a broad range, an enormously broad range of sources he used, always for demonstrating the fact, you know, that you cannot avoid or even escape from a superstition whenever confronted, both to the sacred scriptures as well as to the daily life, the Lebenswelt, you know. So there is a unity in de Groot's mind, you know, between the world of daily experience, Lebenswelt, and Weltanschauung on the other hand, which makes him very interesting. Now, another classic he chose for demonstrating, you know, that since times immemorial, you will find that kind of superstition in China. So you have 2 conflicting ideas, basically, and 2 conflicting perceptions of what the Chinese essence really is. And, well, here you have the rights of the Zhou, that is German. And once again, the Da-Qing-Hui-Dian, this legislatory or statutory compilation of 1899. So he really, what I wanted to show you is that he really was up to date, you know, on founding. This is about feng shui, geomancy, for instance. Here, the Chinese text says, on founding of a town, or the English, they perceive the veins built by mountains and rivers, embrace, and so on and so forth, promising prosperity. So according to this belief, you know, the way you build the tombs for your ancestors will influence your prosperity or your bad destiny to some extent. Now, one of the most faithful readers of de Groot was Max Weber. And once again, you see how this idea of a Chinese world full of superstitions pervades all the ideas that Max Weber expressed about China. From magic, there followed an inviolability of tradition as the proven magical means, and ultimately all bequeathed forms of life conduct were unchangeable if the wrath of the spirits were to be avoided. And that is said about the Confucians, not about everybody, but especially about the rulers of China. Same thing, purely magically conceived spirits, and of course a lack of tension, which he attests to China, a lack of tension with the world. In contrast, of course, to Puritanism and you know, the idea of Protestant ethics. And once again, the high Chinese officials, educated in the old Chinese way, did not hesitate to be edified by the stupidest miracle. So you see, one cannot understand Max Weber's thought about or perception of China without knowing about this predecessor who strongly influenced him, Jan Jakob Maria de Groot. Now, this has not been not contradicted. We have works like this, where Professor Rötz of Bochum University tries in 300 and more pages sort of to devalidate de Groot's arguments. He says, a critique of a view almost degenerated to an educational buzzword that depicts both microcosm and macrocosm of the Chinese in an undissolvable unity without separation of human nature, subject and object, and that is the term universalism. And this is an entire diatribe against de Groot and his followers. Now, I think that the whole question is posed in the wrong way, simply because matters were perhaps more complicated. Now, we rarely have explicit statements and assessments or judgments on mantic practices in the writings of Chinese literati. That is a problem. So I have, been looking for them for years now, and I have found very, very, very few. So few exceptions, of course, at an early time. The great thinker Wang Chung in the 1st century, some earlier masters, which I will not, I won't go into the detail here. But due to the fact that there has been a rather sharp divide, different from what de Groot assumed, between Lebenswelt, this daily life experience, and Weltanschauung, almost all of them have made, almost of these literati, have made experiences with different kinds of fortune-telling, with choosing the propitious day, an auspicious day for a marriage, for a travel, whatsoever. But one has to rely on private utterances, such as brush notes, diaries, letters, and even in these unofficial utterances, we rarely find an attempt to come to grips with the phenomenon. That is the problem. Now, Ji Yun, who was a contemporary, by the way, of Diderot, was one of the few who problematized supernatural phenomena, and divination in particular. So now we'll go to take a look at several of his assessments. Now, his main task, or he's one of the leading sort of literati of the 18th century. That is just only fair to say that about this. One of his main achievements is his activity as one of the two compilers of the most voluminous anthology, Siku Qianshu. Just to give you an idea about the figures, this is the compendium of the 4 sets of books, 10,230 works, 3,470 selected for copying. All the others got a preface, and some got burned, by the way, because of censorship. And under his command were about 4,300 scribes worked. You see, so it took a couple of years to finish that. Now, here you have his Ji Yun's or Ji Xiaolan's entry, or the preface to the section of let me say divination in general. And what he says is quite interesting. He sort of displays the strict official's reservation to these arts. He says they are minor ways. He alludes to a saying of Confucius in the Analects here, but still he says they have been present for a long time. Their principles cannot be entirely dismissed. They were useful. Mind, I mean, this is the main criterion. They have existed for quite a while, and they were useful. There's no way of, really dealing with the problematic of divination in general. The arts of enjoyment, which are the next topic, are grouped under the general category of issue art. Both can be considered as minor ways. So, on the other hand, you have brush notes. This is a genre that started by the 7th century AD, but was really flourishing since the Sung dynasty, more or less 11th century onwards. Now, minor ways require a minor genre to some extent. So what the main statements, the most important assessments, as I said, or judgments on the art on the mantic practices and mantic arts are to be found, and I said it's a rare case, are to be found in his brush notes. Now, this is still true for the 20th century. The leading intellectuals whose diaries and letters reveal their interest and activity and an active practicing of mantic arts, but they would never talk about that. So you would never find that. The most interesting case is the man who translated Montesquieu, Adam Smith, Huxley, and many others, and who really introduced them into China. And he's sort of celebrated in all the biographies I know, even the English language ones, as the paragon of enlightenment in China. Now, take a look at his diaries, and you find it turns out that each week he consulted the classic of changes, and was absolutely obsessed with this art, but you won't find that in his official writing. So that is an interesting thing. Now, in the following, I will just select some of the interesting details of Chieh-Yun's mentioning of mantic arts. There's a lot to say about them, but still. Now, Chieh-Yun, in principle, he absolutely acknowledges the possibility, as you can see here, of fate calculation. It is possible. And then you have ratios, I mean, so many hits, for instance, for this and that fortune teller, and so on and so forth. But they sometimes amount to 85%. And that's qualifying the art and the competence of a fortune teller. All proved right. Perhaps during the discussion we will have time to go into more detail what kinds of mantic practices are concerned here. Sometimes, it is only that the utterance of the fortune teller is not really understood. But that is the mistake of us humans, We humans sometimes are not able to really understand. The prediction is always right. I mean, if it is a good prediction, then it is right, but we have the problems with that. Now, his father, for instance, which you can see here, his father got this nice career still a way of 10,000 miles ahead of you. How frustrating. I mean, and how most depressing for the good father, of Chieh-Yun. But for graduation, you still have to wait another 10,000 years. So 10,000 miles away, 10,000 years. It turns out, the poor father, he had perhaps to advance on another path, not on the official path. But in the year 1713, when he passed the examination successfully as one of the three most successful literati, this was an examination that was called 10,000 years, held to celebrate the Kangxi Emperor's 60th birthday. So it's up to us, to properly understand a prediction. So that is so much for, the veracity, the truth of it. But, and there's always a but. Usually, in the beginning, I had sort of the tendency to divide his utterances into two parts. One, yes, but, and the other one, no, but. But that is a bit too simplistic. So what you can see here is there is something unrefined in the studies of the geomancers, and especially those who make illicit profit, and their words are unreliable. So that was from times of old, it was more or less, forbidden, at least for a member of the gentry to practice divination for profit. But, however, you see, this is the no but however, when there are irrefutable verifications, no false accusations should be made. So this is a deep belief in the possibility of a good prediction. That is what I wanted to say here. Now, and even here, I mean, this is once again a no but. There is an episode which he tells in his brush notes. It's all about interesting topics, my reading experiences, things my father told me, my uncle told me. It's concentric circles. It starts with their own family, and then it sort of, gets broader and broader, friends, neighbors, and so on and so forth. But you can rely on this. I mean, usually one of the main interpretations, especially in mainland China nowadays, is that he was just diverting himself or amusing himself with these stories. But in that case, he would never have mentioned his father. So you see, I mean, there is a kind of trustworthiness and of seriousity, when his father is mentioned. So his father couldn't be wrong. I mean, that is excluded. See, he doesn't mock his father. So you don't understand. I have seen with my own eyes the physical traces of returning ghosts. Let us proceed. This is a long sentence, and we have to go a bit more perhaps into detail here. These illusionary arts involve a lot of legerdemain and clever manipulation. Only spirit writing has definitely some reliability. Now, here in that case, we have to state, I mean, you might have seen some of these pictures. Perhaps this is a Planchette Writing. The genius is supposed to descend into a man's body, and he's got a helper. And this is a kind of dowsing rod, that is writing on the sand. And there's always a translator who would sort of try to, like the Pythian prophetess, who translated the utterances of the Pythia into understandable or intelligible words. Now, this is an old representation, but here you can see the dowsing rod. This guy is very modern, and you see his microphone is there. So this is the one who has to translate the message. But let us just get back a little bit. Of course, as a literatus, he must have been interested in exactly an art, a mantic, a practice that involves writing and poems, poetry. So that is the main thing, of course, which made him so interested and so obsessed with this art. He writes a lot about other arts, other techniques, other practices, but the main thing he's interested in is the most literate one. That is to say, so, and here we start to have a first theory, what I would call an attempt at theorizing the problem. What we call spirits are not Ling. Well, Ling is a difficult word to translate sometimes. Some people have translated as the numinous. This is spiritual efficiency to some extent of themselves, but they depend on humans. The yellow stalks, with which the I Ching or the Book of Changes divination is performed, and the tortoise shells, which go back to the written texts to the 14th century BC, are basically dried wood and rotten bones, but the ability to know the auspicious and the inauspicious relies on human to make them link. So there's an interdependence between man on the one hand and the object of that is sort of revealing the truth. That is the basic thing, and this is the first attempt at theorizing what happens, what is happening, what is going on during a divination. Now, you have taken a look at this. What is interesting here is a saying of his elder brother, Qinghong, who used to say for these cases, people have the understanding that these portents, arise from spirits and that human affairs respond to them. But they don't understand that in point of fact, portents arise from human affairs and the spirits respond to them. But they are by no means unpredictable. So this is how to explain, how to account for the predictability of, and the efficiency, of course, of the oracle. So it is a kind of interaction between humans, but the initiative has to be taken by humans. It starts from the humans. And this is something you would have difficulties to find in other writings of contemporaneous literati, but also of older literati from earlier times. Now, once again, it is a theory about spirit-human communication. It seems to be a miracle, but in fact it is not. We would still say it is a miracle, because, I mean, something happens. An oracle prediction turns out to be true. So this must be something like a miracle. But he does not try to explain away what is going on here on the stage of the spirit writing medium, for instance, or with a certain fortune teller. He tries to problematize the sort of circumnavigate, if I may say, the phenomenon. And now we have a very interesting statement here. If by chance a prediction should accidentally not come true, one should not therefore say that heaven's ways are inscrutable. So I just mentioned, a couple of minutes ago, I mentioned the fact that most of the fortune tellers were sort of measured according to the ratio of their hits, of their predictions that came true. 70%, 85%, that is already a good, almost a maximum. Now, how come a prediction does not come true? We have lots of parallels in European thought, in the history of European thought, especially in medieval thought. Albert the Great talks about the possibility of a prediction that does not come true. And how does he account for that? He accounts for that in the following, more or less. I try to paraphrase his words. He says, with God, everything is absolutely easy, absolutely simple, absolutely clear. And the more it comes down to earth, there are so many factors that are involved that even the best diviner and the best astrologer, in here Albert the Great always talks about astrologers, cannot really predict, or there is a certain chance that he is wrong. And even the great philosopher now, Zhu, who did not know anything about the Christian God, of course, we talk about 1130 to 1200, would say, in these cases, we have the realm of yin and yang, and this is really simple and easy and sort of a clear atmosphere. And everything, all predictions rely on this atmosphere, on this clear and sober atmosphere of the yin and yang. But the more, it descends down to earth, the more factors once again are involved. And he expresses that with not the same words, of course, but he comes to the same conclusion without knowing anything about, let me say, in that case, Aristotle, especially, who has to be cited in these contexts. the whole tradition of Western, or Augustine, of course, also a whole tradition of Western philosophy. So the background of this idea that by chance a prediction should accidentally not come true has a philosophical background. That is to say, that the more complicated things get on Earth, the higher is the possibility of a mistake of even the best diviner. Now, even he was very interested he had to spend a couple of years in exile in what is nowadays the Xinjiang province in the west of the People's Republic of China. And there he came across some Mongols, was highly interested in their ways of divining, their ways of fortune telling. They used sheep bones, but in the same in the same vein, he would say they based themselves on the sheep bones to pick out romantic images, and this corresponds to what we know, our bones, the oracle bones, and when they base themselves on physical objects, this corresponds to what we know, the milfoil, that is the yellow stalks of the book of the Classic of Changes. So not only that he approaches romantic practices in this highly theorizing, highly theorizing for Chinese conditions, highly theorizing attitude, but he also makes or tries to establish similarities and resemblances, which is an interesting thing. So this is really the universal approach to that phenomenon. Now, sometimes, of course, it can happen that as we have seen already, that something goes wrong. And this is why, because here the interaction between a human being and the spirit does not work. It's not the question, he does not question the very fact of interaction, but what he questions is here, apparently, a human being had either the right question, but it had not the right question, or the spirit was not willing to answer it. Something went wrong. Let us just go back for this idea of this interaction between spirits and humans. In that context, we will have to mention a famous person who lies buried in the Uppsala Cathedral, namely Emanuel Swedenborg. And if you look at, of course, first of all, Kant's fervent and devastating critique of Swedenborg, the dreams of a spirit seer, as you know, die Träume eines Geisteswissenschaftlichen. And if you look at the controversy that went on during Emanuel Swedenborg's entire life, that was even put into question after his death, then you will see the high degree, of course, the high degree of sophistication this Western debate occupied in the 18th century, 17th, 18th, we are the 18th century more or less. Kant is, in fact, a contemporary more or less of this guy here with whom I try to introduce to you. Now, in his later years, Kant said, we have to demonstrate that human soul is, even during our lifetime, in an inextricable community with all immaterial natures of the spirit world. That is a fine saying, of course, a fine dictum, of which man is not conscious enough. So this is the old Immanuel Kant. And the problem is, of course, that what I think being a spirit, I don't remember being a human and vice versa. So he excludes, on the one hand, this communication, this intrinsic and inextricable communication between human beings and spirits on the one hand. But here, that seems to be given. That seems to be given, and it is a kind of theory that accounts for, or that tries to explain the fact how oracles, or why oracles become efficient. Now, we have another question still to address, a last one. No, before, of course, the big warning. The reserved official, as we have known him from his first entry and the preface of the great anthology. The stern and severe official who says, you may divert yourself, you may amuse yourself because you are literatus and you're deeply obsessed, so to speak, with the art of writing. And of course, spirit writing is a kind of challenge to all these literati. You may sing in accord with the rules of poetry as if you were watching a theater play. But, however, in case of divining for the auspicious and the inauspicious, the superior man has to fear the outcome. That is to say, that is a warning. That is not an exclusion. This sentence does not exclude the possibility, as I have said, as I have shown it in the beginning of this talk. He presupposes the possibility of an efficient oracle, but it is dangerous. So try to stay away. And unfortunately, we know of his brush notes and from his brush notes that he did not stay away, that he was always challenged and sort of seduced by the possibility of obtaining a good prediction, or a bad one, in fact. That did not really count. Now, the last question here in this context that has to be addressed is the question of predetermination. That has, of course, as you know, intrigued together with the problems around the free will, the concept of librum arbitrium, the West for ages and centuries. And here you have a clear utterance, a clear statement, all events are predestined, how could this not be true? Now, the code of fate, it's an interesting, this is my translation. This is the word for numbers, shu. And it's just, you could say this is all about numerology. It isn't. Numbers stand for fate. So how to translate that? And in German, I would say Chiffre. This is a kind of Chiffre, but if you say that in English, it doesn't work. So in that case, I chose something like the code. The code of fate is predetermined. Therefore, the spirits are in a position to know it beforehand. They know it, we have to interact with them, and then we will know it. However, there are cases when an event has not yet begun to occur. The most unimportant effect, with the causal chain of the system of retribution, nothing to do with all that, when even jokes and trivialities that are not worth talking about, and which certainly are not of the sort that can be noted beforehand in the registers of the underworld, even these one is able to very often know or predict beforehand. So the prediction is, the possibility of prediction extends even to the most trifling matters. That is also an important thing because of the fact that everything is preordained and predetermined. Now, this is the jocular way to put it, because there are different schools. We have the practitioners of horoscopes on the one hand, and we have the practitioners of feng shui, the geomancy, Chinese geomancy. Now, we have learned at the beginning that geomancy presupposes that by establishing or arranging a gravesite, a tomb, in the right way, your ancestors will exert a benevolent influence on your prosperity. So this is a way to alter destiny, to alter fate, to modify it at least. So he replied, but this is the guy, this is the person who represents the practitioners of horoscopes, and they had this deterministic view on fate. Whereas in the other, in the feng shui style, you would say, no, I can alter fate. Now, once again, you have here someone whose words all came true, and once again, an elaboration, a rather sophisticated elaboration for his time and his civilization of this interaction between humans and spirits. And now here you have one of the most intriguing citations, which I haven't come to grips yet with. Because here you have said, this is an official from the underworld. And so perhaps it's just the opinion of the underworld official. But what happens here is that he said a fixed code, that is to say, once again, my fate, can that be modified? What the fixed code predicts, can one do anything about it? And the answer is yes, it can. In case an issue is something highly desirable, it can be modified. In case an issue is highly undesirable, it can be modified, or one may do something about it. I had a long discussion with Christoph Hafsmeyer about this, but I haven't yet understood the entire importance of that. Now, who does the fixing? Who does modifying? And the ghost, that is to say the official of the underworld, replies, the person concerned fixes and modifies it himself. The ghosts and the spirit have no handle on it. Now, that is a blunt contradiction to what he has said above, if you remember well. So there are several possibilities. This is perhaps, as I said at the beginning, the yes but and the no but way of articulating the problem, or it is a way of educating people. Because the official from the underworld, one of his tasks may be to educate people. The pedagogic approach, raising the tip of your finger and saying, okay, you can modify it. It is in your hands. It is a possibility, although I, the literatus and the great compiler of the largest anthology mankind has ever seen, I have a different opinion. So it's up to us to, I have really not found a solution yet for this sentence here, this passage. But in any case, the philosophy, and this is wisdom philosophy, that basically which you find, well, one might perhaps have some doubts about this, but this is basically Stoic philosophy. You have to make peace with your fate, whether you are a failure or a success. But if not, you will not stop. You will stop at nothing, racing along in competition for eminence. Now you see. So that is one thing. And then the second is heaven and earth give birth to talent. And the court appoints officials, and that is to remedy the code inherent in my vital breath or whatever, the pneuma, of the chi. So one thing has to be said in this context here, that is the fact that in Ji Yun's view, there is no possibility to predict the future for a society or the state or a collective. It is restricted and it is limited to individuals only. That is interesting, because we know, of course, of hundreds of years of advice given by fortune tellers of advice to rulers. And here he categorically excludes this possibility. This is perhaps related to the fact that he was a state official. So don't interfere in my job here. That is a possibility. Now, you see the same thing, the sort of resemblance between what heaven orders on the one hand and the punishing of the ruler. Here you have the official speaking. That is quite evident. the last thing is that, of course, you have moments of basically the old sages, the sages of old, they were considered, or they are considered to have been fortune tellers at the same time. They were able to predict the future. This is the glorious past. This is the golden age of divination. Now we have come to an age of decline. But sometimes predictions come true with amazing exactitude. And this is the blissful appearance of glorious antiquity in our times. And this is the moment which he enjoys the most when he goes to a spirit writer. So how else could we recall and bring to mind the past buried in ancient books? So this is really the blissful thing that appears, das Wiederauftauchen of der Vergangenheit, of the past. Now the sage, in fact, has divined. But nowadays, you have professional practitioners, petty people who are not able to do this. But, however, from time to time, and the book is full of meetings and encounters with successful diviners, so that is a part of a contradiction, but that is also the classical lip service one has to pay to the past, the glorious past. Arts can come to an end because the most important thing is not books, it's not contained in books, but it is oral transmission. So he also has a kind of view of these possibilities. Now you can see that here's someone. So first of all, I want to mention that once again, this is not someone who, as many of his commentators in present times especially say, this is a guy who spins a yarn. This is a guy who is amusing and diverting himself with telling strange stories about ghosts and spirits and so on. No, this was someone who was really sincerely interested in the functioning of these mantic practices and the interaction of humans and spirits. Now, here someone with rational methods, with rational means, so to speak, tries to analyze the irrational. And so the idea of China being completely rational or completely superstitious is, I think, too simplistic, because his reflections cannot be boxed into any of these modern Western categories. And this is something we should think about before we use these categories in a most erroneous way. And just to finish this, I want to show you some of these ghosts. In fact, famous Chinese painter Ming, who was almost a contemporary of Ji Yun, who had, this is a large scroll which is called Ghost Amusements, or Guiqu, and he was absolutely convinced that he had met these ghosts. You can find this in his writings. There's no theorizing about it, as is the case for Ji Yun, but here you have a nice, entertaining image, but with still contending that he in person had met these ghosts. This is interesting, by the way, but it doesn't have much to do with the topic. You see the skeletons, and one of the Jesuits in 17th century used Andreas Versalius, De Humani Corporis Fabricas Libri Septem, for illustrating skeletons. And since anatomy was not practiced at that time, he just took over, especially the right one. I cannot show you the picture, but have a look at Andreas Vesalius, and you will see this is the perfect copy of what this painter and anatomist of the 16th century had done. And just to conclude, you will find a last ghost who is perhaps one of the species or comes from the species of hungry ghosts. We will see that is just, I mean, sort of an illustration of the ghosts that Ji-yun might have had in mind. Thank you for your attention.